You have arrived at the event entitled Cultural Infrastructures as Drivers of People-Centered Climate Action. Today's event is co-sponsored by Culture 2030 Goal and the Climate Heritage Network in partnership with the UCLG Culture Committee and Europa Nostra. My name is Andrew Potts, and I'm the coordinator of the Climate Heritage Network. The Climate Heritage Network exists to help mobilize arts, culture, and heritage for climate action. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's event along with my colleague, Angelica Arias. Angelica is the executive director of the Instituto Metropolitano de Patrimonio in Quito, Ecuador. And I'm now going to give the floor to Angelica to welcome you in Spanish and to make some housekeeping announcements. And then I'll repeat those announcements in English, and then we'll get to the substance of our program. Angelica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Andrew. Y buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches con todos, queridos colegas, ponentes y asistentes. Andrew Potts es el coordinador general de la Climate Heritage Network y además es el mentor de esta red que inició en el año 2018 como un espacio colaborativo entre instituciones, gobiernos de distinto nivel y organizaciones de alrededor de todo el mundo, quienes estamos convencidos del importante papel de la cultura, las artes y el patrimonio al momento de hablar sobre cambio climático. Como ya lo dijo Andrew, yo soy Angélica Arias, los saludo desde la costa del país. Hoy no estoy desde Quito, de donde soy directora ejecutiva del Instituto Metropolitano de Patrimonio y además copresidente para Latinoamérica y el Caribe de la Climate Heritage Network, desde donde ya agradecemos su valiosa presencia en este debate que se da como parte de Resiliart en preparación del Mondiacult 2022. Quiero iniciar resaltando este espacio de reflexión que UNESCO y su conferencia sobre políticas culturales y desarrollo sostenible han abierto para conversar sobre el cambio climático como un desafío que define a nuestros tiempos y a la vez hablar sobre cuál es el papel de la cultura, las artes y el patrimonio para el tratamiento de esta problemática desde las políticas culturales. Aprovecho también para agradecer a Europa Nostra y a CGLU, nuestros compañeros en este conversatorio. Este evento se va a presentar tanto en inglés como en español, como ya lo dijo Andrew. Es así que para acceder a la traducción al español, por favor, hay que hacer clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior del panel de Zoom. Ahí está este icono que es como un globo terráqueo. Hay que hacer clic ahí y luego seleccionar el canal en español. Esperamos tener tiempo para responder inquietudes al final. Estas pueden ser hechas tanto en inglés como en español en la sección de preguntas y respuestas en la parte inferior. Por favor, no lo hagan en el chat, sino en esta parte que yo les digo de preguntas y respuestas. Finalizadas estas pequeñas instrucciones, ahora sí, pasemos a lo importante, que es la temática que nos trae el día de hoy y que ha servido de provocación para nuestros panelistas. Esta temática es: ¿pueden las infraestructuras culturales impulsar la acción climática centrada en las personas? Le doy otra vez la palabra a Andrew. Please, Andrew, let's start. Continue, please.
Thank you, Angelica. Just to repeat in English a few of the housekeeping notes that Angelica made in Spanish. As you can see, this program is offered in both Spanish and English. To hear the interpretation, you need to click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen, select interpretation, and pick your channel. The opening presentations in this event will be made in English, but the concluding panel will be made in Spanish with English translation. Also, we hope to be able to take a few questions from the attendees. If you have a question regarding the first three talks, please put it in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A. As Angelica said, you can make your questions in Spanish or English, and we hope to be able to pose one or two of them to our speakers. But even if we don't get to address all of the questions in this event, it's still very valuable that you share your questions in the Q&A and also your views in the chat, because we will take account of the questions and the chat when we prepare the report of this event. I also want to note that the translation and other support for today's event have been provided by UCLG, the Committee on Culture of the United Cities and Local Governments. And so big thanks to UCLG and to Jordi and Sarah. Okay, with that, going to move on to the substance of our program and I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what we have in mind for today. Our event focuses on the intersection of the climate emergency and cultural policy, as Angelica said. It's being held in the framework of Resiliart, a global effort to inform the preparation of Mondiacult 2022, otherwise known as the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development. This is an event being held in September of this year that aims to examine the role of cultural policies in tackling global challenges. We're hosting this event because we believe that climate change and the twin crisis of biodiversity loss are indeed defining challenges of our time, that art, culture, and heritage can significantly contribute to tackling them, and we hypothesize that well-constructed cultural policy can help unlock this potential. We think these matters are urgent and that the Mondiacult process can perhaps help advance solutions at scale. That the world needs more help tackling climate change is, I think, beyond doubt. 6+ years after adoption of the Paris Agreement, the goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels is barely alive. Just yesterday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its new report on current and future climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the findings are grim. UN Secretary General Guterres called the report an atlas of human suffering. And he added it reflects, and I'm quoting here, a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And so the world is off track. Off track how? How do we account for this great failing of climate leadership? One growing critique holds that prevailing models of climate planning are falling short because they fixate on large-scale, simple, technological, and market-based solutions, and they miss factors less easy to quantify, the socio-economic context of the climate emergency. Attention to culture could help fill this gap. Traditional knowledge that predates the fossil fuel era can point the way to post-carbon living. The worldviews of indigenous peoples and local communities that were never co-opted by modern take, make, waste approaches offer counterpoints to prevailing paradigms of quote-unquote progress. Artistic and imaginative tools hold the potential to challenge our petroculture and interpret today's carbonscapes. Cultural approaches tend to be people-centered and to be place-based. And so given this, it raises the question, why have we not seen the cultural dimension of the climate crisis foregrounded? Honestly, not even by some cultural institutions and arts and heritage public bodies. Could one of the reasons be that, yes, culture is a part of the response to climate change, but culture is also a part of the problem of climate change? Our lifeways, our consumption and production patterns, at least in industrialized countries, are deeply entangled with fossil fuels and extractive systems. Environmental humanities colleagues call these petrocultures, and the places we've created carbonscapes. Suffice to say then that the intersection of climate and culture is complicated, and this has profound implications for getting cultural climate policy right. These are some of the questions with which we must grapple, including at Mondiacult, and today we take a step forward in advancing this debate. So let's get to it. The structure of the event we have for you today is as follows. We'll start with a keynote talk and then 2 slightly shorter talks. That will be followed by a roundtable where participants will react to what we have heard, and we'll also try to fit in a question or 2 then. Those will be in English with translation to Spanish. We'll conclude with a panel in Spanish that will carry this conversation to the action level, addressing how cultural voices can bring a people-centered approach to climate planning. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. We prepared a provocation for today's debate, and we'll put a link to that in the chat. If you were able to have a look at it, you will notice that it borrows liberally from an article that was published last year, just before the 2021 UN Climate Conference, COP26, entitled 3 Decades of Climate Mitigation, Why Haven't We Bent the Global Emissions Curve? The article has been widely praised for its analysis of what's blocking progress on tackling climate change, and it appealed to us because of the uncommonly thoughtful way that it weaves in the socio-cultural dimension. And so we thought it would provide an excellent touchstone for today's debate. And I'm delighted to say that we have for our keynote speaker, Isaac Stoddard, who is the lead author of that article. Isaac is a PhD candidate in natural resources and sustainable development in the Department of Earth Sciences at Uppsala University. His current research is focused on the strategies and imaginaries, note that word, imaginaries, informing regional climate and energy transition within Sweden. Isaac, congratulations on this article, and thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll try to share my screen here and see if that works. Let's see here. Let's try that. Thumbs up, anyone?
We see your slide, but not in the slide. Perfect.
Great. So thanks, Andrew, for that very kind introduction, and thanks also for this invitation. And I'm very honored to be able to share this this stage, I guess, digital stage, with Elizabeth and with Isabel as well. So it's great to be here with the two of you as well. And hopefully we'll have different entry points into this question to provide some interesting provocations for your work, your important work up ahead. I call this talk 3 Decades of Climate Mitigation, mirroring the article that was just mentioned, and added what now? And I guess I should say also bienvenidos a todos. Lo siento, no puedo continuar en español, pero puede discutir más tarde en español también, pero solamente un idioma a veces. So 3 decades of rising emissions. I guess it's important to note that it was now more than 3 decades ago we had the first IPCC report that was published in 1990. And in 2019, carbon emissions were about 60% higher than they were in 1990. And in 2020, they continue to rise. And looking at a graph from the article that was mentioned before, if one looks at the details of this, you can also note that over these last 3 decades, so only 30 years, we've emitted more than 50% of all fossil carbon that has been emitted throughout human history. So it's quite an incredible amount of emissions that have been released in this very short period of time. And important to note here as well is, of course, the uneven distribution of where these emissions come from. So if you look at this graph, you can see that the so-called developed countries, so the richer industrialized countries, have only or less than 20% of the population, but are still responsible for more than half of the emissions in the last 30 years. And if you look at all of history, of course, a much larger proportion than that. And I guess the third thing I wanted to point out with this graph is just to see the different attempts from the international community to curb these emissions. You have IPCC reports, various climate negotiations and agreements, and still the curve has continued upwards, with some small exceptions for the so-called financial crisis of 2008, and also, of course, during COVID, which is nothing to romanticize because that has other other devastating effects, of course. So to begin with this article, I guess a little bit of background might be interesting for all of you. The question that provided the title of this article actually came from one of the lead authors of the upcoming IPCC report, the so-called third working groups report, which is coming later this year, focusing on the question of mitigation, so how to decrease emissions. And it came to my colleague, Kevin Anderson, who's one of the co-authors on the paper as well. And I guess it came because Kevin has been quite outspokenly critical of particularly the third working group's work and the assumptions underpinning the synthesis of knowledge that takes place there. So they basically asked him to write a critique of what they've been doing so far and to see if they could do things differently in terms of the kinds of assumptions and models that are dominating the work of the third IPCC working group and how we think about trying to decrease emissions. He said he didn't have time, but stupidly enough, I said I volunteered my time as a PhD candidate. And now in hindsight, I didn't realize that this would take close to a year probably to write this article. And quite quickly, we also realized that of course, two guys from the UK and Sweden couldn't even pretend to start answering this question with any form of legitimacy. So we invited a number of colleagues from around the world and from different disciplines and backgrounds. But I guess with one of the common themes being in their work, being that they have been willing to sort of question the orthodoxy of knowledge production within their own disciplines or their own fields. And we asked these 22 other authors to join us in the writing of this paper because we had identified a number of sub-questions to this bigger question, which basically was, how come we've had 30 years of research, 30 years of negotiations, all sorts of different climate action, and still emissions just are continuing upwards on a global level and also on a national level, more or less everywhere. And the 9 different sub-themes that we developed as sort of things to look into further were the following. So the first one was international climate governance. The second one was vested interests in the fossil fuel industry. The third was geopolitics and militarism. The fourth was economics and the financialization of, well, almost everything these days. The fifth one was the forms of modeling that take place that informs climate policy today. And we focused here on mitigation modeling, so how to bring down emissions. We had another sub-theme of energy supply systems, another one looking at inequity and equity, an 8th one looking at high carbon lifestyles, and a 9th one looking at social imaginaries. And I could give a lecture on each one, of course, maybe, but for this particular talk, that won't be possible. So I simply just mentioned them here. And they're all 9 different entry points that sketch a very kind of multi-dimensional issue or predicament, one could say, in terms of why we have failed so badly over these last 30 years. And they have different explanations, but there were some themes that evolved as common across these 9 different lenses, as we call them. And one such central theme was the theme of power. And power manifests in very different forms. And our way of clustering these different forms of power doesn't do justice to each contribution, but still it says something. And one form of power that we found dominant in these three first lenses was a form of entrenched and I guess raw institutional power that we characterized with calling it the Davos cluster. So the Davos referring to the World Economic Forum that meets every year in Davos, and a sort of top-down gaze on these issues. The second form of power that we identified was that of what we call the enablers. So here, this would include a lot of the so-called experts and academics and maybe even consultants that have the power to continue to support what we call in our paper the Davos mentality and approaches, but also the power to start undermining it. And the third form of power that we identified or drew out of this analysis was what we called the ostrich and phoenix cluster. So another, I guess, allegorical or metaphorical reference to ostriches sticking their heads in the sand, which they don't really actually do, I think, but at least that's the myth. Not paying attention to the sort of problems we have in our world. The other side of that being phoenixes that are the mythological phoenix, the mythological bird phoenix that is reborn out of the ashes of its predecessor. So the potential for really changing things. And I guess this cluster of lenses sort of captured the idea of the power of ideas, I guess, and also the power of the example to do something differently. And for the rest of the talk here, I'll just focus on the social imaginaries part and how that connects to these clusters of power that we identified in our paper. And what is this word social imaginaries? It sounds a bit tricky. So in the paper, we define it as collective images of how we might live. And in industrial modern societies, sort of the countries that many of us writing this paper come from, these social imaginaries, unfortunately, are rarely a radical departure from the past. And they're dominated by technocratic forms of modeling, cost-benefit analysis, and various forms of forecasting. And these imaginaries are very political, of course. They're sites of political contestation, and there's an active marginalization that we found or that we write about that excludes everything that might break from the past or the present as well. And here we also sort of point a finger towards the institutions that we find ourselves in, which is research and educational institutions, and the active role that they're playing in reproducing a lot of the problems that have created the problem in the first place. So I'll say something very briefly on the two things I circled here, and then just to mention this podcast episode with a friend of mine, Per Johansson, who's a historian of ideas from Sweden, also talking about, what actually are ideas and what happens once ideas are manifested in our societies and in a material sense. They unfortunately can get quite hard to get rid of. So power, ideas have a lot of power, especially when they become manifest. And that's, I guess, something why there's a strong reason also to criticize certain forms of ideas, which we do quite explicitly in our paper. One of them being the modeling exercises that dominate the IPCC's work on mitigation. And these are known as integrated assessment models. I won't go into the details here, but very simply, they are coupled socioeconomic models with sort of climate models. So you bring a climate model together with socioeconomic models to find the optimum solution. So it's a sort of idea of optimization of various factors that we argue aren't comparable. And one of the problems with these models is not only that, but also that they make assumptions. So one of the assumptions that is quite common in such models that informs almost all climate policy today is that we will develop so-called negative emission technologies. And every year, our oceans and our land masses take up about 20 gigatons of carbon from out of the carbon that we release into the atmosphere. So that's about half of what we emit. And the assumptions in a lot of these models are that these negative emission technologies, which don't exist at all at scale today, will be developed and suck another 10 to 20 gigatons of carbon every year during this century, later in this century, which would be equal to another biosphere. So these are astronomical assumptions that are underpinning a lot of the models and therefore also the policies informing our climate policies today. And this, I think there's a lot of value in criticizing things, and that's what we do a lot in our paper, but I also realize that there's limitations. And this is something that I've thought a lot about actually after writing this paper, is the limits of critique and what the value of critique is. Sometimes you really need to point things out, but there's also a value of just doing things differently instead of just pointing out what's wrong, if that is possible at all. This reference here is to the Decolonial Futures Network and their work on thinking about institutional reform, which I've been very inspired by before writing this article as well over the last few years. And they talk about here 3 forms of reform, so soft reform, radical reform, and beyond reform. And now thinking about it, actually, I think our paper would fit quite nicely into this sort of radical reform space here. So we're asking basically the same questions, that a lot of people are asking, but then we try to come up with a few different answers. So resituating climate change, not simply as a problem to be fixed, but as a symptom of a highly unsustainable and unjust particular development paradigm. But I think we need to start looking at the idea of beyond reform as well, much more. And that goes for not only educational institutions, but most institutions that are products of our time. And what do we do if we realize that an institution we work in, like a university, is beyond reform? Well, you can either walk away from it, which some people do. You can try to hack it, which I think I've been involved in or culpable of at times. Or you can try, as Vanessa Machado de Oliveira suggests with colleagues in 2015, you can try to hospice an institution that needs to disappear. I think this is an interesting choice of words. So helping them die. And this, I think also, to me, I'm reading a book right now by a French, rather radical, anonymous writing collective called The Invisible Committee. And they talk about destitution, which is, I think, another way to talk about hospicing as well. And there they talk about to have a destitution gesture does not oppose the institution. It doesn't even mount a frontal fight. It neutralizes it, empties it of its substance, then steps to the side and watches it expire. To destitute the university, which is a place I spend a lot of time in, is to establish at a distance the places of research, of education and thought that are more vibrant and more demanding than it is, which would not be too hard. And to greet the arrival of the last vigorous minds who are tired of frequenting the academic zombies, and only then to administer its death blow. So this is quite radical in some ways, and I think, but one thing I think they really, bring in, which is really important at another point in this book, is this idea that if the world is to be saved, this will be in each of its fragments. So the importance of place and of people, like you talked about, Andrew. As for the totality, it can only be managed. I think this is an important lesson to people like myself that work a lot with concepts. Academics love concepts, and I think we need concepts in order to think. Like the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said, it's not the problem that we abstract things. The problem is that we're not vigilant of our abstractions. So we don't think about what they do in the world. And I think something like climate change, something like energy, something like culture, or cultural policy has effects in how we sort of approach the world and how we think about possible things to do in it. So I think this is something important to remember always. I think another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and this is from a paper that I recently read also after publishing this paper that we've just published, is the work of Indigenous scholar Kyle White from Northeastern US. And this article where he talks about that for many cultures and many peoples and many around the world, their worlds have already ended. So this idea of this kind of the future catastrophe, which climate change in many ways is, of course, is not, that is the end of certain worlds, but it's not necessarily the end of all worlds. And I think, White points this out in this paper, that his ancestors would see the world that he lives in today as a dystopian world. It's not something in the future, it's something that we already live with. And this is a way to sort of reframe, I think, the issues that I think I'm moving in this direction much more lately. In particular, because we're seeing so much talk about transforming our world, from the pages of UN reports to the UN Secretary General, to the elites in World Economic Forum, talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and even apps helping us to transform our world, so we can wake up every morning and check how we can transform our world, like we wouldn't be able to do that on our own. So for me, in terms of thinking about heritage and culture, that I guess is the focus of your work, I think it's really interesting to sort of juxtapose this idea of rapidly transforming our world to a question of asking what is it that we really need to care for in our worlds, and what is it that we don't want to lose in the process of transforming our worlds as well, because I think it asks some very different questions than the ones that I started out with in this presentation and that informed the analysis of our paper. So I think our paper complements this perspective that I'm sort of ending on here with a reference to two books I'm reading at the moment that have given me some inspiration in terms of thinking about climate change and the ecological crisis we're in a very different way. That starts from place and starts from care and starts from a perspective that includes not only the human, but the more than human world. So with those words, I will end my talk, and I hope I didn't run over time too much to take time from Elizabeth or Isabel, who I'm looking forward to listening to now. So thanks, and this is the reference to the article.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you, Isaac. And I put a link to the article in the chat, and I encourage everyone to read it. We've now invited two more speakers to follow on to the presentation Isaac has given to help us start to think about how we translate some of the observations he has made into the context of cultural action and cultural policy. Isaac used some provocative, shocking words about radical departure from the past, about hospicing ideas of the past. So what does this mean for people who work every day in promoting culture, including existing culture, whose work is to safeguard existing heritage? How do cultural actors address these petrocultures with their extractive take-make waste systems and unsustainable consumption and production patterns? How do we contextualize and interpret the heritage of carbonscapes? To help us advance this conversation, we've invited Dr. Elizabeth Kreider-Reed to join us. Elizabeth is Chancellor's Professor in Anthropology and Museum Studies at the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts in Indianapolis in the USA, and she's the Director of the Cultural Heritage Research Center there. She's an accomplished scholar in archaeology, art history, and public history, and especially relevant for today, she's the coordinator of the Toxic Heritage Research Collaborative. And we've asked Elizabeth to make a short intervention today on the topic, Toxic Heritage and Climate Change, Lessons for Cultural Policy. Elizabeth, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation. So thank you all for organizing it, for being here today. Advancing. And,
yes, looks good.
But it's not advancing, sorry. There we go. I think just a anyway, so my contribution today is to explore this idea of toxic heritage, in particular, its potential for addressing climate crisis and for inspiring action. So what exactly do I mean by toxic heritage? In my usage, the concept has two elements, and I understand other people have used it in a more metaphorical way, but I mean specifically, first, the history of the substances and processes that create physical harms or threats of harms to environments, soil, water, air, etc., and the life supported within them, the plants, animals, humans. Second, it also includes the intersections of that history of harm with both formal heritage institutions and informal memory practices. This concept of toxic heritage invites us to consider, on the one hand, what is the heritage of sites of environmental harm? That is, what is their history and how is it remembered, commemorated, and interpreted as heritage? On the other hand, toxic heritage also demands that we consider aspects of environmental harm of existing heritage sites, particularly in places associated with the carbonscape. So thinking, as Isaac said, what is the work that this concept can actually do in the world? And to that end, most importantly for our conversation today, how can toxic heritage help shift paradigms of petroculture and engage broad audiences in people-centered climate action? Now, let me use post-industrial coal heritage sites in the UK as a way to explore these questions further. And I'll note by starting that these sites are powerful storytellers, and therefore I think powerful tools to thinking about how we can flip these paradigms. They have the authenticity of miners' voices, compelling immersive experiences in reconstructed and actual mines and mine works. And they also have the emotional resonance of narratives of sacrifice, tragedy, heroism, and community. These post-industrial sites also typically present their stories within the frameworks of geological determinism and extractive capitalism. The communities in the narratives of these sites, quote, owe their existence to the geology, and their destinies are shaped by the, quote, natural resources. As the George Perry quote at the Museum of Iron states, it is, quote, as if nature had intended this place for an iron foundry. Furthermore, these, quote, natural resources are, as the description of the Thames River at the Museum of London succinctly puts it, capital, or in this case, liquid capital. The exhibitions of objects reinforce this ideology of extractive capitalism. Coal is king, it's the protagonist of the story and the star of the object theater. But while extractive capitalism, geological determinism, and valorized workers are the dominant narrative, that isn't the whole story. For example, at Ingenuity, a children's museum in Ironbridge, which, as you likely know, is the World Heritage Site that claims to be the, quote, birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, You can make iron in this wonderful interactive blast furnace by jumping on raw materials of coke and iron ore and limestone. And once you've had your fill of crushing ore, you can go on to read the panel, Revolution and Repair. In this panel, the text could not be clearer. Darby's use of coke to smelt iron was, quote, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the acceleration of climate change. It goes on to explain the link between coal burning and rising CO2 levels and notes the threat to all life on Earth. The panel closes with the questions, how can we now use human innovation to fix our climate, protect nature and our oceans, and create a world that is free from waste? What can you do to help? Unless you think that it's an aberration of a children's museum, consider the industrial history exhibit at the National Waterfront Museum in Swansea. It doesn't get more institutionalized than that. And in this exhibit, they connect the history of oil and gas to the production of greenhouse gases. So clearly, connections between history and our current climate crisis can be made if the museums have the will. So what are the implications of this notion of toxic heritage for cultural policy and for the work before us as heritage and cultural professionals in responding to the climate crisis? Some of the most prominent debates have focused on policies regarding the entanglements of heritage organizations and the petrochemical industry. I suggest there is a similar opportunity to question the influence of funding on industry-focused historical sites as well. For example, what are the implications of BP's funding of the Museum of Scottish Shale Oil Industry, which includes a massive shale oil themed play area? But beyond corporate funding, there's rich potential in taking a critical approach to toxic heritage. We know the widespread work of decolonizing museums is gaining momentum. Museums are similarly tackling tough issues related to human rights and social justice, including imperialism, slavery, and structural racism. And I suggest that toxic heritage offers the same potential to spur dialogue and action. Some museums are absolutely addressing climate change and sustainable practices, particularly in focused temporary exhibits, but these are often disconnected from history. Disconnected from the places where people are already engaged in the narratives, in their place-based sense of identity and connection in history. And this example here is from a recent exhibit at the National Museum of Scotland, which highlighted clean energy practices. But upstairs in that very same museum, the history exhibit, The Story of Scotland, still tells a traditional valorized story of a proud coal heritage. And so I would encourage those thinking about cultural policy to consider mobilizing energy around interpreting toxic heritage, specifically its potential to help people make connections in a variety of dimensions. It connects scales of impact from the molecular level to terraforming, from bodies to communities to the planet. It connects past and present, local and global. It can use the power of heritage sites to create narratives that center historical actors and their agency, while also making connections to the lived experience of descendant communities, those in so-called sacrifice zones, and other consequences of environmental injustice. Framing histories as toxic heritage is finally about offering counter-narratives to the extractive capitalism and naturalized carbonscape that is the legacy of the Anthropocene. It's a way to help people see the connections of the economic and cultural practices of capitalism with both environmental harm and systemic inequalities. Now, there's so much exciting and powerful work that's taking place around the globe, and perhaps that's part of the report. Just train has already left the station, and pay attention to it. So I am grateful to all those people who are working to mobilize culture in response to the climate crisis, as well as to be able to be a part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was enormously helpful and provocative enough when you apply it to literal toxic heritage sites, as you said. even more mind-bending when you expand to the metaphorical toxic heritage of all of the sprawl and exurbia and petroculture suburbs, not to mention toxic cultural practices of wasteful consumption and production. But I think you've pointed the way for how we can tackle all of that and more. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to our second talk of the day. One of the points made in the article written by Isaac and his colleagues is that artistic and imaginative tools can support a profound examination of inherited assumptions and desires and hold the potential to transformatively reinterpret today's carbonscapes and its accompanying mindsets. It's an enormously appealing proposition, but how can that be unleashed at scale, and can cultural policy help? Our next speaker is enormously well-suited to help us enter this topic. She is Isabelle Fremont, and we've asked Isabelle to speak on the topic against extractivist art towards a culture of reciprocity, the potential of artistic and imaginative tools to transform today's carbonscape. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Sorry, thank you very much. I will also do the screen share bit. Can you see it? Is it okay? Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this much needed discussion. And thank you very much for the great insight by Isaac and Elizabeth. They are tough acts to follow. I'd like to start again from this much known and yet still striking appeal that was made in 2018 by the IPCC. As Isaac underlined, they're not exactly known for their revolutionary spirit or position. And yet in 2018, they wrote that if we wanted to avoid the worst of the climate catastrophe, we had 12 years left for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And for us, and when I say us, I talk about the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, which is a collective that I co-founded with Jay Jordan. For us, that necessarily means changing the way we make art. Even though many people have already seen their worlds collapse, indeed, there are very few artists or performer or actor or designer that has actually ever had to work in such a moment of history, where it is much easier to imagine the collapse of life on Earth than imagining how we can find the right ways to live together. So we must change our imaginaries without doubt. Yet, as one of the chapters of a book that I recently published with Jay Jordan points out, we've had 200 years of art and the world is getting worse. And in there, we develop an idea inspired by art historian Larry Shinner that actually art is an invention. It occurred around the 1750s in the bourgeois, white, European colonial metropolis. And it actually came in parallel with the Industrial Revolution and the inventions in the machines that have led to our extractivist fossil fuel burning industrial capitalist system. These are not coincidental. And for most of human history and for most of the world's cultures, there is no word to describe what we in most of our over-industrialized world are calling art. And that is not to say that there was no artistic practice. Art is a fusion of the Latin ars and the Greek techne, and it actually meant any human activity. There could have been horse breaking or shoemaking or verse writing or vase painting or governing or cooking or medicine or navigation. These were all considered an art, and this not because they were done by an artist, but because it was performed with grace and skill. Grace is an act of thinking with and thanking the world. The word comes from the Old French, grâce, meaning thanks, as in grâce à, as in gratitude. To thank the life for giving us life, mutual reciprocity, that is the core of a practice which no longer separates ethics and aesthetics. That is an art of life. But around 1750, the things that were considered part of the traditional concept of art began to be split apart genius versus skill, beautiful versus useful, art versus craft, culture versus nature, art versus life. And without these violent rifts, all the ideals, the practices, and the institutions that make up the art system, and indeed much of the general Capitalistine infrastructures, would collapse. And this particular European invention has actually colonized our imagination. And ever since, intellectuals, entrepreneurs, missionaries, armies, and all sorts of spreaders of monocultures have actually made damn sure that this invention had become an unchallengeable universal. And as Ariella Aisha Azule points out, from the beginning, art has been one of imperialism's preferred terrain. Imperial violence is not secondary to art, but constitutive of it. And yet, faced with the unfolding ecological and social disasters, artists seem to us to act like vampires. They grab the issues to take them back to the white cubes of the gallery, the dark box of the theater, or if they're a bit more courageous, the messiness of the street. Such as, for instance, Eliasson and Rosens with Ice Watch, heliporting ice from the Arctic to central Paris for people to watch it melt during the COP21. But perhaps the best term is not vampire, though, because vampires don't have a choice. Artists do. Perhaps we could actually call these practices extractivist art. Extractivism takes nature, stuff, material from somewhere and transforms it into something that makes profit somewhere else. That profit elsewhere is always more important than the destruction it causes, than the continuation of life of the communities from which wealth is extracted. Extractivism is the opposite of responsibility. It is the opposite of reciprocity. So much creativity is put into building empty mirrors of this dying world rather than constructing ways to resist and building other worlds. The catastrophe may well have been integrated as a topic, and there is constant inventiveness in art's material forms, but its essence has not been reinvented, partly because art as we know it is still very much conceived of as a universal defining feature of civilization. The concerts and the performances, the interventions and the installations of extractivist art all speak about, comment on, explore the subject. They invite us to spur a debate or a conversation. They involve the attentive transformation of space and bodies, light and time. They attempt to make things beautiful or strange. They make visible an invisible problem or invite a polemic. They ask us to reflect. They don't show us how to act. And often the artist is deeply concerned by the issue and the communities affected by it routinely become their material. But in the end, the most important thing is not how the work can be part of a strategy against the problem, but that the material is extracted and transformed into good art. The work does not really give back despite all its claims. What benefits most is the artist's career and the further legitimization of the institutions promoting art as we know it. Whether the work nourishes and sustains the social movements or communities invested in these issues is hardly ever on the agenda. So whom do such pieces serve ultimately? For us at the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, in this time of crisis, the key to art is not to show the world to people, but to transform it together. And to do so means to join the movements fighting for life against the economy above all else. Because as the premise of this event so rightly underlines, developing new imaginaries is absolutely necessary in these dark times. But imaginaries must be rooted in practice, not simply reflect them. And so with the lab, we've been embedding ourselves in movements for climate justice since 2004, bringing artists and activists together to reinvent modes and tools of resistance. We have worked with climate camps in the noughties, always blurring the line between organizers and artists and treating organizing as an art. We have, for instance, co-created shields carrying portraits of people affected by climate chaos to push through police lines to occupy the HQ of climate criminal corporations. Sometimes these objects end up in museums, such as the shields in the London V&A, but that's really not the point at all. We have worked during COP mobilizations, starting in art galleries, to reinvent how to use bicycles as tools of disobedience to protect a gathering of indigenous and frontline activists from the police. We have invented new methodologies to mobilize with joy and humor against the despair and cynicism that categorize our era. There are thousands of ways to stop feeding this mortiferous carbon space. But how can artists deploy an imaginary of reciprocal culture, of commons building, of place building, if they are themselves living as atomized, hypermobile, uprooted individuals? Again, imaginaries must be rooted in practice, in place, in community, so that they don't end up floating meaninglessly. Artists, like everyone else, should step out of their comfort zone, should step out of the ego-driven career system and put their skills and talents at the service of a culture of resistance, one that is rooted and non-extractive. Join the movements that need imagination and creativity. So why make an installation about refugees being stuck at the border when you could co-design tools to cut through fences? Why write a play inspired by neo-animism when you could be co-devising the dramaturgy of community rituals? Why make a performance reflecting on the silence after the songbirds go extinct when you could actually be co-creating ingenious ways of sabotaging the pesticide factories that annihilate them? Why make a dance piece about food riots when your skills could craft crowd choreographies to disrupt fascist rallies? Why continue with art as we know it when you could desert this neuroculture which fiddles while watching a world burn? Why not dissolve art back to its ancient roots in ritual, the age-old theater of magic, where communities of bodies perform a desire that is so intense and focused that it bends reality? Why continue to extract life when we could be given back to it? I'm speaking to you from our collective home on the ZAD of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, from a yurt where there should have been the duty-free of an international airport planned on these 4,000 acres of wetland. And that was saved from a climate-wrecking infrastructure project through 40 years of a creative struggle that brought together an extraordinary diversity of people, including many artists, that demonstrated the power of a culture of resistance. And the wetlands here remained wetlands. The farmlands remains food-producing land, and the airport will only ever be a negative shade. And for us, this is the art of life today, a gesture of reciprocity rather than extractivism. And that means turning back the monoculture machine, decolonizing a place from capital, and opening it up as somewhere that enables forms of life to flourish evermore. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel, for that inspiring talk. And for those of you that are intrigued to know more, and I'm sure it's everyone, I want to reiterate that Isabel's recently written a book about the experience, artist interventions to block that airport project, called "We Are Nature Defending Itself, Entangling Art, Activism, and Autonomous Zones." And I put a link to that book in the chat. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to a roundtable. And I've really given the roundtable an impossible job. It's quite unfair. I've really impossible in two ways. First, I've asked them to pick out really only one or two of the points they've heard today and to react to them, perhaps elevating points that they want to make sure make it into our report. And second, I've asked them to give some thought about how to connect it to cultural policy. I'm a cultural policy lawyer, and so I can admit it's rather a prosaic assignment in view of the provocations we've just heard. But I keep reminding ourselves that we have the dream that cultural policy can help sustain these types of engagements at scale. The good news is that even though the assignment of the roundtable is difficult, the participants in the roundtable are geniuses, are very well suited for the task. I'll introduce them briefly. Our first panelist is Jordi Pasquale, and Jordi is the founder and director of the Committee on Culture of United Cities and local governments. Our second panelist, Alison Tickle. Alison is the founder and director of Julie's Bicycle. And our third speaker, Azden Koskan-Oner. And Azden works with the cultural heritage of the city of Izmir in Turkey. And so all people working in cultural policy in their own way. And so, Jordi, let me start with you and ask you, of what you've heard, what do you want to elevate? What do you think we should emphasize when we go to Mondiacult? What strikes you?
I loved everything, Andrew. Congratulations, Isabel, Elizabeth, Isaac. Outstanding presentations. I loved all what you said. When I was listening to Isaac, I couldn't refrain to think how responsible we are also, we, cultural policymakers, of this failure. Because we are responsible of that failure. And I went back 40 years, 1982, Mondiacult, the first Mondiacult, with a frame which is, okay, not decolonial, not post-colonial, but the final declaration of Mondiacult 82 defends the equal dignity of all cultures. But this mandate is not, say, made operational until 1987, when our creative diversity is published. 1986, 1995, 1996. Our creative diversity, civil society-led report under UNESCO finishes with a clear cultural rights mandate, with a bold cultural rights mandate. Leave no one behind, leave no place behind, establishment of international bodies for cultural rights, for human rights and culture, right of expression, freedom of speech, right to participate in cultural life. This is meant to be fully operational in 1998, the Stockholm Conference on Cultural Policies. But it does not happen. It does not happen because this agenda does not go with the winds of globalization. It does not go with the winds of the creative economy. This concept is newer, but instead, cultural policies in 1998, because in 1998 it happens Stockholm, but also the Culture Counts conference in Florence, organized by the World Bank. And this is the agenda that prevails. This is the agenda that prevails. Culture counts, make the sector grow, attract businesses, attract tourism. This is the agenda that prevails. And we are here with a new Mondiacult, now with a special rapporteur on cultural rights, which has done, the three of them, three women, have done outstanding contributions to the place of culture in the frame of human rights, with several organizations, including UCLG, having made very clear recommendations to members, to cities and local governments, to embrace the narrative of cultural rights and to translate that narrative with specific policies, programs, projects at a local level that place people at the center of cultural policies. And this is where we are. Frankly, I wish Mondiacult 2022 proclaims that yes, culture is a public good, and this is the main motto that UNESCO is promoting, but also goes beyond that, because this is a 1990s statement, cultural public good, even 1980s. We need to make this operational with concrete national policies. We have to make nations accountable on their cultural policies and to invite them to adopt a cultural rights perspective, which certainly includes making peace with Mother Earth. I could say many other things because Isabel, Elizabeth, Isaac were extremely powerful, but I think I stop here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jordi. Alison, what in 4 minutes? It's terrible, I know. What strikes you?
So, well, thank you again. I'd like to just echo Jordi's appreciation to Isaac, Isabel, and Elizabeth, and of course to you too, Jordi. I think fundamentally, so what I'm taking from this is interconnectivity and the need to root change in action, because of course the climate crisis is fundamentally a cultural crisis. I think we're agreed on that. As Isabel has said, and Jordi's affirmed, too many narratives about culture, including the arts, conform to this worldview where the creative industries are valued, especially by policymakers, as tools of the economy, and the arts and culture are frequently used to reinforce the stories behind a particular extractive worldview. There's a persistent idea, I get it all the time, that art and design is neutral, it's autonomous, artistic freedom needs to trump all other considerations, and that turning into climate and the environment is going to constrain the artist. And this myth utterly fails to account for power dynamics, and it fails to account for context. These culture wars, diametrically opposed versions of history and civilization, are central to the climate crisis. And we, especially we, I think Isabel expressed this really well, we custodians of culture, we are makers of art, and therefore we need to take on, I think, the responsibility of world makers we cannot afford to turn away. At this critical point, a call for imaginaries, for artistic radical action, and for heritage stories. I think the critical point I want to make about this is what we've learned is that the arts is an ecosystem. Changes to one part are felt by all. And so instead of focusing on false binaries, artists or art or the way that we work, we need to focus on the whole, supporting all parts of that ecosystem to together rethink cultural practice in its entirety that nourishes art, and that creates the imaginaries, and policy really needs to help. This in turn puts us in a really good position to speak to policy outside culture. Climate policy should start with culture, of that I'm really clear, and cultural policy should start with climate, of that I'm equally clear. We've worked with arts policy for many years. The arts themselves are hampered by a lack of evidence, and I mean rich evidence, stories, voices, as well as data to make a case for transformation in cultural policy and policy in the round, a lack which also prevents cultural voices from contributing to radical solutions, speaking to power and stewarding intimately our felt experiences of injustice and of now. And I know this works. Julie's Bicycles worked with arts policy for years and years, and our national arts body, Arts Council England, has been in dialogue with the arts community to work this out, and it changes everything because it requires arts practice to embody values of care, of love, of intimacy, which is how to create those imaginaries across the art system. It isn't what you think, it's what you do. And I just want to very quickly pick up on some of the work that we've been doing around policy in the months preceding COP. We did a big global look at where cultural policy met climate and the environment and found creative resurgence is everywhere. It's on the ground. It's deeply connected to grassroots practice. But the arts and cultural policy community is, in spite of the Paris Agreement, not making requirements for climate action. They're not speaking to commitments for absolute carbon reductions, not net zero, absolute reductions, nor to environmental justice, and nor to a just transition. Yet they are speaking to environmental issues, particularly relating to justice around, for example, cultural rights, inclusion, and locality. This is a huge missed opportunity to speak to Mother Earth. All the answers are there. I know, because Julie's Bicycle has looked, and policymakers, we need to help policymakers choose to see it, especially after yesterday's IPCC report and the voices we've heard today. It is so clear that where we have privilege, where we have agency, putting that in service to Mother Earth through a lens of cultural and climate justice is the clarion call, and this call is absolute.
Great, well said. Thank you, Alison. Austin, you have a different perspective. You help manage an actual cultural landscape, a historic landscape in Izmir and Turkey on the ground. What about this conversation strikes you from your unique perspective there?
Thank you very much. This is the first time I'm a respondent, so I'm a little excited. Sorry for my excitement. I'm very impressed with all the presentations, and also especially Isabel's art issues, because we are dealing with culture, and I'm working in the cultural assets unit for 12 years, and we are dealing with both raising the awareness of the people about culture and their belongings and their cultural heritage, and we get the success by participating the local people to the projects. When we take their impressions about project areas, cultural heritage, we get the success. In our municipality, we adopt the concept of circular culture. You know, we were awarded the metropolitan metropolitis ne söyleyeceğim. Chittaslow metropolis, you know. And its concept is the circular culture, harmony with nature, harmony with the past, harmony with history, and we think that culture is the base point to be successful, and that's it.
Yeah, no.
If you wish, I can add something also. We are describing a new urban culture in Izmir that includes all these pillars. Cities are seen as ecosystem that fosters calmness and harmony instead of populism and autocracy. It unites arts, sciences, and our dreams.
Perfect. Thank you, Austin. You know, Austin's colleague, maybe her boss, I can say, the mayor of Izmir municipality, Tunç Soyer, gave a speech at the UCLG Culture Summit last year, where he made the observation that economy without culture is what has given us climate change. And it's a provocative philosophy, perhaps, but what is remarkable is the effort of a large municipal government to carry forward these ideas in the governance of the municipality. And that's quite extraordinary. And Austin is on the ground in that effort with the municipality, and we thank you. So it's terrible to say, but we'll have to end the roundtable at this point. And I'm sorry we can't have a richer conversation. We were constrained to 90 minutes, and I want to leave the last 20 minutes for our panel. But if you have responses, please put them in the chat, because we will record the chat and we will incorporate the inputs in the chat into the outcome document of this event. So thank you for our panelists. I love this effort to connect what we heard from our speakers into the policy level. How can we nurture it and scale it and grow it? And now we're going to move to our final panel, where we're going to explore these topics even further. And I want to now give the floor back to my co-moderator, Angelica Arias. And Angelica, ask you to introduce the panelists and take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you too. Well, me paso al idioma español. Pueden pasarse también a la traducción, como ya les dije, en la parte inferior del Zoom. Y bueno, en esta segunda parte, primero quería agradecer por las exposiciones tan interesantes. Yo creo que a todos nos pasó que se nos ha movido el piso, nos ha hecho reflexionar mucho. Lo que se nos presenta son grandes desafíos, porque ya lo hemos visto, la cultura es a la vez parte de la causa y también parte de la respuesta al cambio climático. En este sentido, se han visibilizado las tensiones y sus implicaciones para la política cultural. En esta sección de nuestro conversatorio, como ya ven, hemos pasado al español nuevamente para escuchar a 3 panelistas latinoamericanos que nos acompañan desde Colombia, desde Ecuador y desde México, con 3 miradas distintas, desde su valiosa experiencia en industrias creativas, en arte y en patrimonio cultural respecto al tema. ¿Cómo pueden las voces culturales aportar un enfoque centrado en las personas a la planificación climática que aborde las dimensiones socioeconómicas de la crisis climática? En primer lugar, vamos a escuchar a Paula Trujillo, de Colombia. Ella es especialista y gestora en el mundo de las economías creativas y culturales entre Europa y América Latina desde hace más de 15 años. Ha sido gerente del primer Hub Creativo de Colombia, acción detonante del Distrito Creativo de Medellín en la zona industrial del Perpetuo Socorro. Trabajó la estrategia de internacionalización de Medellín en el periodo en el que la ciudad decidió pasar del miedo a la esperanza, como directora de negocios internacionales y directora ejecutiva de la Agencia para la Cooperación e Inversión de la ciudad. Es socia fundadora y directora de estrategia del think tank Conexiones Creativas, plataforma que trabaja con gobiernos, instituciones, creadores y empresarios en pro de los ecosistemas creativos y culturales en Iberoamérica. Luego, en segundo lugar, escucharemos a Simón Gangotena, del Ecuador. Él es violista, director musical y gestor cultural con amplia trayectoria nacional e internacional en música orquestal, de cámara, dirección musical e interpretación histórica de la música. Ha tocado con agrupaciones internacionales en Australia, Estados Unidos, Bélgica y Holanda, y es violista invitado en Australia e Italia. Simón es fundador, director ejecutivo y musical de la Fundación In Concerto, organización dedicada a la generación y gestión de proyectos culturales y musicales en el Ecuador. Uno de los proyectos emblemáticos de la Fundación es el Festival Música Ocupa, cuyo objetivo principal es la descentralización y democratización de la música clásica, el rescate del patrimonio cultural, material e inmaterial, y la construcción de diálogos sociales, culturales, políticos y ambientales dentro de nuestra sociedad a partir de la música. Para cerrar nuestro panel en español, escucharemos a Saúl Alcántara Onofre, de México, arquitecto de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, con especialización en restauración de monumentos y centros históricos en la Escuela de Restauración de Florencia, Italia, con maestría en arquitectura de paisaje en la Universidad de Estudios de Génova, Italia, y con doctorado en diseño en la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Saúl es miembro titular del Seminario de Cultura Mexicana, miembro emérito de la Academia Nacional de Arquitectura. Él es presidente del Consejo Internacional de Monumentos y Sitios, ICOMOS mexicano. Saúl es autor de diversos libros y de proyectos de restauración integral, recuperación del patrimonio edificado y de paisaje. Repito la pregunta que se les hizo a los 3 panelistas: ¿cómo pueden las voces culturales aportar un enfoque centrado en las personas a la planificación climática que aborde las dimensiones socioeconómicas de la crisis climática? Paula, por favor, te damos el espacio. Lamento, y al igual que dijo Andrew, son 4 minutos, pero tenemos unos grandes panelistas a quienes escucharemos el día de hoy. Tienes el espacio, Paula.
Muy buenos días, Angélica. Un saludo muy especial para ti y todo el agradecimiento a Andrew. Nos convocaron ante una pregunta central, y es cómo las infraestructuras culturales pueden impulsar la acción climática centrada en las personas. ¿Qué tal si la pregunta es cómo hacer que los procesos de cambio climático centrados en las personas se vuelvan una cultura gracias, entre otras, a las prácticas creativas y culturales? Bajo esa reformulación de la pregunta, evidentemente pensé mucho por qué en Conexiones Creativas desde hace tiempo hemos decidido no hablar de sector o de sistema cuando hablamos de cultura y de creatividad. Nos gusta llamarlo ecosistema creativo y cultural. Seguramente hay algo allí de fondo que ya nos estaba enlazando con esta reflexión superior, porque en momentos tan aciagos como los que vivimos hoy, de pandemias, invasiones y guerras, quisiera aplaudir el hecho de que nos sentemos aquí a ser capaces de hablar del presente y también del mañana, seguramente porque los retos medioambientales y el cambio climático son asuntos superiores a los dolores que día a día podemos estar viviendo. Y es por eso que en esa reflexión, en esa reformulación de la pregunta, he querido compartirles este mapa mental que espero estén viendo todos ustedes, que se titula La Era del Entrelazamiento, una propuesta de Neri Oxman, arquitecta radicada en Estados Unidos, de origen israelita, que nos ha invitado desde hace algún tiempo a reconciliar, a reconectar arte, ciencia, diseño e ingeniería. Posiblemente en momentos donde todo nos separa, el distanciamiento físico que impuso la pandemia, la desconfianza política, las invasiones y las guerras, lo que necesitamos es justamente eso, juntanza, entrelazarnos. A lo mejor las prácticas creativas y culturales han también padecido de una endogamia peligrosa. Nos hemos solamente juntado músicos con músicos y arquitectos con arquitectos y llegó el momento de que arquitectos, diseñadores, músicos se sienten con biólogos, con científicos, con diseñadores. Es por eso que surgen proyectos tan interesantes que quiero invitarlos a que tengan en la agenda o convocatorias tan interesantes como START, un proyecto de la Unión Europea del que participan muchas instituciones del mundo de la ciencia, muchos museos, etcétera, buscando justamente que todos los proyectos que se presenten respondan a una juntanza entre arte y ciencia. Eso sí que me parecería interesante y es que justamente esa política o esa mirada que desde Conexiones Creativas llamamos de polinización cruzada es absolutamente necesaria. Así que un llamado que me gustaría hacer a todos los pares y colegas que están aquí es cómo desde nuestros territorios, desde nuestras convocatorias, desde nuestros eventos, empezamos a generar un territorio mucho más mixto, mucho más híbrido. Y cierro entonces, para ser responsable con mi tiempo, con 5 ejemplos muy breves que me parecen interesantes, porque la ponencia de mi colega Elizabeth, que la hizo previamente, me dejó muy conmovida, así como la ponencia que hizo también Isabel Fremont, y es el arte por el arte es válido en términos del placer vital, pero quizás estamos en el momento del rol utilitarista, ojo lo que digo, el rol utilitarista del arte y de la cultura en torno a atender los retos y las transformaciones superiores. Y en esa mirada de entender el rol que el arte y la cultura están llamados a jugar en nuestros tiempos, 5 ejemplos muy breves. El primero de ellos, un film titulado Tribugá, contribuyó, entre muchas otras manifestaciones lideradas por ambientalistas, por músicos, por diseñadores, por artistas, a frenar un sueño histórico que yo calificaría de peligroso, de construir un puerto justamente en una de las zonas de más biodiversidad del planeta, que está justamente en el Chocó colombiano. Después de muchos años de luchas desde la cultura, se ha pedido por fin a la UNESCO que declare la bahía de Tribugá como reserva de la biosfera y esta película, Tribugá, cumplió un rol fundamental. Segundo ejemplo breve con el que hemos podido trabajar, tropisme, justamente en Montpellier. Me hizo pensar mucho en Elizabeth cuando hablaba de Toxic Heritage. Y este es un proyecto de territorio creativo y cultural impulsado por una cooperativa en lo que antes era un emplazamiento militar que dividía, separaba 4 barrios profundamente diversos con problemáticas muy profundas en lo social. Hoy esta cooperativa, Ilusión Macadamia, ha impulsado este proyecto bajo el Fair Place, que además lo llama tropismo, que es ese estímulo natural, ese fenómeno biológico que quieren justamente que signifique este lugar en Montpellier. Tercer ejemplo rápido, y me conectó al instante con Isabel Fremont, Flora Arts Natura, un proyecto liderado por un curador de arte colombiano llamado José Roca y su esposa Adriana Hurtado, que justamente buscaba reconciliar en Colombia el arte y la naturaleza con dos sedes, una en un pequeño pueblo patrimonial llamado Honda y otra en la capital, Bogotá. Un proyecto que tristemente hoy está en pausa fruto de la pandemia, pero José Roca es uno de los grandes curadores de arte, por eso hoy es el curador de la Bienal de Sydney, y ese espíritu de arte naturaleza de su proyecto Flora Ars Natura seguro la acompaña. Y cerraría con un ejemplo que además me llena el alma, y es en Medellín. Más allá de que haya sido a finales de los 80 la ciudad tristemente más violenta del planeta por encima de Beirut, que estaba bajo el fuego, Medellín hoy tristemente tiene otra historia, y es que es una ciudad azotada por la polución y la contaminación. No sé si ustedes saben que, según estudios de una de las universidades públicas de Medellín, una persona muere en Medellín cada 3 horas fruto de la contaminación del aire, que hay 4 veces más cáncer de pulmón en Medellín que en la capital, Bogotá. Más allá de razones geográficas, porque Medellín es un valle rodeado de montañas que no podemos desconocer, quiere decir que también la violencia medioambiental está matando la ciudad. En el corazón de esa ciudad llamada Medellín, con este problema profundo de polución, surge la propuesta de la que pude hacer parte, que ya les presentaba Angélica, del Distrito Creativo de Medellín, el Perpetuo Socorro, justo en la zona más contaminada de una ciudad ya contaminada, que es el centro, 62 hectáreas de la ciudad. Ese proyecto que se incubó en aras de revitalizar esta zona industrial, cuidando mucho el tema de gentrificación, reconectando los distintos polos de la ciudad, hoy, con mucho orgullo, ya no hago parte, pero lo sigo acompañando, se ha postulado a un proyecto TOTNAMA desde hace 2 años y ya está en fase de preselección, que justamente busca reconectar los cerros alrededor de este distrito creativo y cultural con un proyecto medioambiental de alto impacto. Así que sí, yo sí que estoy de acuerdo en el rol utilitario del arte y la cultura en lo que tiene que ver con lo superior, que es los retos medioambientales. Gracias, Angélica.
Muchas gracias, querida Paula. Pasemos, por favor, a Simón Gangotena. Está Simón aquí en la sala. Te dejo la plataforma a ti, querido Simón.
Muchas gracias, Angélica. Hola, buenos días a los y las de este lado del planeta y buenas tardes para Europa. Soy Simón Gangotena, director de la Fundación Inconcerto. Como Angélica ya lo dijo, Inconcerto es un colectivo interdisciplinario que busca posicionar al arte, en específico a la música clásica, como una herramienta para construir relaciones más humanas, empáticas y sensibles. Quiero agradecer a todas y todas los que han generado este espacio tan importante por la invitación y dejarme contar nuestra experiencia y perspectiva justo desde la acción artística. Quiero mostrarles rápidamente esta foto que fue tomada en el 2019 debajo de un árbol en medio del Chocó andino ecuatoriano. Es una zona declarada como Reserva de la Biosfera por UNESCO en el 2018. ¿Cómo un dúo de música clásica llega a tocar en un espacio como este? Poniendo incluso en riesgo sus instrumentos por la humedad del bosque nublado. Y bueno, Inconcerto nació hace 10 años con las ganas de músicos de reconfigurar el imaginario elitista que tiene la música clásica, sobre todo en nuestros países latinoamericanos. Nos motivó esa idea de generar puentes entre nuevas audiencias y la música clásica, un poco borrar la separación que se ha generado por años entre ella y nuestros contextos. Así fue que la sacamos de sus espacios acostumbrados y las vamos a dar vueltas por lugares inusuales como barrios periféricos, espacios públicos, centros de rehabilitación de adicciones, centros de privación de libertad. Y en ese camino fuimos confirmando una corazonada que teníamos al iniciar, que al reconstruir los protocolos de la música clásica, podíamos tener un espacio de encuentro humano único, un espacio sensible para reconocernos un poco mejor. Entonces nos dimos cuenta que si nos nutríamos de otras visiones del mundo, la sociología, el urbanismo, la comunicación social, los estudios culturales, etcétera, podíamos incluso dar un paso más allá. Y así empezamos a desarrollar acciones musicales para reflexionar y sensibilizarnos sobre temas que nos competen a todos y todas: el género, la migración, la invisibilización de nuestros ancianos y el trabajo, la resignificación del patrimonio y, claro, también de alguna forma el cambio climático y la conservación. En definitiva, nos dimos cuenta que generalmente el problema se da en la separación con la otredad y la relación de poder que se genera. Las jerarquías en el género, el miedo y el rechazo al migrante, la ubicación del hombre como centro y sin armonía con su entorno, ¿no es cierto? Quisimos, a partir de nuestra producción artística, examinar esas divisiones y generar un encuentro para poder acercar esas diferencias. Entonces, ¿por qué fuimos al Chocó Andino a tocar debajo de ese hermoso árbol? Fue parte de un rodaje del capítulo piloto de nuestro proyecto Sesiones al Natural en el 2019, proyecto desarrollado junto a la productora audiovisual Estefanía Bravo. Y Sesiones al Natural busca la visibilización, revalorización y resignificación de los 14 ecosistemas del Ecuador a través de una exploración estética y narrativa. Con este proyecto justamente buscamos generar ese espacio de sensibilización. A través de la música clásica, de lo sonoro, reflexionamos sobre la relación que hemos construido con nuestro entorno, donde hemos puesto a la naturaleza como un objeto y no como un sujeto, y en realidad nos hemos separado de ello. Entonces, al haber estado en el espacio, poder interactuar con los sonidos del bosque, haber podido tocar una pieza de Bach o Mozart y que un tucán, que pocas veces se deja ver, me responda al tocar, que esa experiencia se transforme en un video que llega a 2, 3, 50,000 personas, que estas personas puedan sentirse parte del bosque y se sientan movidas por el mensaje, me hace estar convencido justo de la incidencia positiva que podríamos tener como artistas. Como Inconcerto, nosotros no somos especialistas ni en cambio climático, ni en conservación, ni en migración o género, pero con las acciones nos hemos dado cuenta y palpado que desde la experiencia misma, desde lo que puede generar el arte, vemos la importancia de él. Y sin dudar, pienso que desde esta perspectiva podríamos ser más parte de la solución. Como dijo Isabel en su presentación hace un momento, creo que deberíamos como artistas salir de esa zona de confort para atacar estos problemas. Eso, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, querido Simón. Y dejo para el último espacio de nuestro conversatorio en español a Saúl, por favor. Tienes toda la palabra en este momento.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes. Mi agradecimiento a Angélica Arias, a María Augusta Mendoza y a Andrew Piot por invitarme a este panel. Yo vi la pregunta desde el punto de vista de infraestructura cultural. Para mí es el paisaje, por ejemplo, desde mi disciplina, o planificación climática, planificación paisajística. Entonces, bueno, en las primeras décadas del siglo XXI, con diversidad de desafíos sin precedentes impuestos por los procesos de industrialización, el crecimiento desbordado de las ciudades y la pandemia ocasionada por la COVID-19, el arte del paisaje está por cambiar el mundo, especialmente en el continente americano, que cuenta con la Carta del Paisaje de las Américas, signada en el año 2018 en el Seminario de Cultura Mexicana por la IFLA. Es el momento para que el arte del paisaje fructifique la oportunidad de posicionarse para tomar el papel protagónico en la recalificación monumental y ambiental del territorio, de la revaloración de la vegetación y la fauna nativa y endémica de cada región del continente americano, para construir una nueva sociedad urbanizada, globalizada, interconectada con los medios digitales o remotos. La arquitectura de paisaje es una disciplina que privilegia la supervivencia de los ecosistemas naturales y humanos interrelacionados entre sí. Debe revalorar la dialéctica y armonía entre la natura, la tierra y el ser humano, dirigir el desarrollo urbano a través del diseño, planificación y conservación de paisajes y jardines, de acuerdo con los postulados de la Carta del Paisaje de las Américas. El paisaje debe ser proyectado y protegido como una conexión entre la tierra, el ser humano y el espíritu. El proceso de industrialización, de metropolización, es decir, conurbaciones que se articulan funcional, territorial, económica, política y demográficamente, de cada lugar a enormes zonas metropolitanas con un gran deterioro social, injusticia ambiental y contaminación. Estas zonas son susceptibles para una recalificación ambiental o paisajística a través de la recuperación y puesta en valor de la arquitectura, sobre todo del espacio público. Yo bajo una escala menor de lo que han estado hablando los panelistas anteriores. La restitución de la calidad de vida en el espacio público proporciona una ocasión única para que la arquitectura de paisaje como disciplina sea un elemento de recalificación y puesta en valor de los asentamientos humanos en decadencia. La arquitectura de paisaje es de vital importancia, desde la perspectiva de proponer soluciones a la crisis energética y ambiental, recobrar la identidad y espiritualidad de la sociedad, restituir el vínculo cosmogónico con la naturaleza y la tierra. Las ciudades americanas tienen que recuperar sus paisajes rural, cultural y urbano. En el transcurso de estos retos ambientales y culturales mundiales, el valor de la arquitectura de paisaje como profesión e investigación científica tiene una gran trascendencia debido a su capacidad para, permítame, es que estuve viendo el reloj para que no me pase el tiempo, proponer soluciones a la crisis, recobrar identidad y espiritual de la sociedad, restituir el vínculo cosmogónico con la naturaleza y la tierra. Las ciudades americanas tienen que recuperar sus paisajes. En el transcurso de estos retos ambientales y culturales mundiales, el valor de la arquitectura de paisaje como profesión tiene una gran trascendencia debido a su capacidad para analizar la problemática de los procesos naturales y biológicos, los atributos culturales e históricos y los elementos cosmogónicos o espirituales. En la Ciudad de México, la transformación caótica y sociocultural comenzó en la década de 1950, la cual ha causado una crisis nacional y de identidad cultural, ya que la ciudad comenzó a desbordarse hacia su área metropolitana sin organización, sin planificación. Esta crisis de identidad es particularmente evidente en la disciplina de la planificación urbana, que privilegia estándares urbanos en lugar de calidad de vida. Por otra parte está el desafío de la pérdida de espiritualidad hacia la naturaleza y la tierra, donde según los mexicanos antiguos nuestra alma descansa y nuestra existencia se dedica a hacer nuestras vidas significativas. En el México prehispánico, la naturaleza y principalmente el árbol, desde el punto de vista simbólico y sagrado, ha sido un antecesor del ser humano y simboliza a nuestro padre, el gran gobernante, o en lengua náhuatl, Hueytlatuani. El árbol posee vida espiritual propia y la población lo veneraba ofreciéndole responsos, canciones y palabras de devoción. Le entregaba todos sus tesoros y hasta su propia sangre. Antaño cada planta tenía un mensaje cultural y espiritual. Hoy en día se desprecia a los árboles porque rompen aceras, tiran hojas o bloquean la visibilidad de la publicidad exterior. El árbol era un ser protector, era el padre, el cosmos, servía a la humanidad, personificaba la creación, la vida, la muerte, el sustento, el beneficio utilitario y venerable en muchos sentidos. Ha sido sacro, celestial, profano, venerado y útil según los códices o el cronista lo describe. Uno de los regalos de la naturaleza que los antiguos mexicanos respetaban y hasta lo convertían en deidad. Es un ser que forma parte de la comunidad y que merece ser amado, y porque lo veían como parte de su familia, como ascendiente divino y venerable. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Saúl. Realmente hemos corrido con todo estos paneles que hemos tenido el día de hoy. Creo que nos hemos quedado todos con ganas de seguir escuchándoles y debatiendo sobre la temática. Solo voy a decir algunas palabras que me quedaron dando vueltas, como ecosistemas creativos, mezclarnos, hibridizarnos, lo inusual, lo que no estamos acostumbrados a hacer, los encuentros humanos, la cosmogonía, la espiritualidad, entre muchas otras cosas que nos han inspirado el día de hoy. Con esto terminamos. Le voy a dar la palabra a Andrew para que haga el cierre de esta exposición, no sin antes agradecerles a todos ustedes por haber sido parte de este conversatorio que deja una semilla sembrada para nuevos eventos de este tipo y nuevos debates. Muchísimas gracias y ha sido un gusto estar con todos ustedes.
Thank you, dear Angelica. We've reached the end of our time and the end of our program. It was short, I know, but I prefer to think of it as tantalizing. We will use, the good news is it's not the end of this discussion, but rather we will take the ideas that we have heard today and we will synthesize them for the purpose of proposing to UNESCO and colleagues that these issues be heavily focused on at Mondiacult in September, and that they be a driving topic of the setting of cultural policy around the world in as many forums as possible. I close with a 30-second observation. Yesterday, when the IPCC report was issued, there were some remarks from Inger Andersen. Maybe you know her. She's the executive director of the UN Environment Program, and before that, the Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. And Inger Andersen said, humanity has spent centuries treating nature like its worst enemy. The truth is that nature can be our savior. And I was struck by her observation about the centuries of culture and heritage pursuing what has proved to be an unsustainable and uncontinuable paradigm of extractive use of people and nature. And for us who work on promoting culture and safeguarding heritage, what to do with that centuries accumulation, it's a defining task of our time. At the same time, for all those centuries, there has always been counterpoint. There has always been dissent. There have always been communities that have lived outside that model. And so how do we lift up and elevate those voices today when their perspectives are so central? These are, as I said, defining questions for cultural policy. And these are the points I think that we will be bringing to Mondiacult and to cultural policy venues around the world. I thank you for helping us clarify these topics and for helping us create this record. I hope we will be in touch, in communion in the coming months and years to carry this forward. Thank you for joining us. And finally, thank you for the sponsors of today's event, Culture 2030 Goal and the Climate Heritage Network, to our partners, UCLG Culture and Europa Nostra, and again, special thanks to UCLG Culture for their logistical support and supporting today's translation. One of the worst monocultures we have is this linguistic monoculture, where we try to talk about things in only a few languages. And at least today, we were able to proceed in 2 languages, and you already saw how much more richer the conversation was. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and more to come. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Muchas
Gracias.
gracias.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
A todos.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Chao, gracias.
Ciao, ciao.
Gracias, ciao.
Felicitats, Andrew. Well done.
Thank you to all our
Congrats to all.
speakers. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to meet you all. Thanks so much, Andrew, once again. Amazing.